On Christmas Eve, 1989, a married couple, both experienced pilots, disappeared from a small regional airport in rural Montana, leaving behind their twin-engine Cessna with the engine still warm, and their Christmas gifts scattered across the tarmac. For 35 years, their fate remained a mystery. But when a construction crew breaks ground on a new hangar in 2024, they unearth something that changes everything. A discovery so disturbing, it forces investigators to question whether the couple ever intended to fly at all. If you're drawn to stories of unsolved mysteries and the secrets that refuse to stay buried, subscribe to hear how the truth finally surfaced after more than 3 decades of silence. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across Clearwater Regional Airport, blanketing the single runway in pristine white. Inside the modest control tower, Frank Garrison sipped lukewarm coffee and watched the clock tick toward midnight. Christmas Eve, 1989, and he was alone with the hum of equipment and the occasional crackle of the radio. He'd sent the couple on their way hours ago, Daniel and Catherine Shaw, both certified pilots, both eager to reach Catherine's parents in Spokane before Christmas morning. Frank had watched them perform their pre-flight checks with professional precision, had cleared them for departure, had seen the Cessna's lights taxiing toward the runway. Then his phone had rung. A personal call, his daughter in the hospital. By the time he'd returned to the window 5 minutes later, the Cessna sat dark and silent on the tarmac, its engine ticking as it cooled. The cabin door stood open. Snow drifted into the empty cockpit. Frank had searched the hangar, the terminal, the parking lot. Their car remained where they'd left it. Their luggage sat in the plane. Wrapped Christmas presents lay scattered near the landing gear, as if dropped in haste. He'd called the sheriff at 11:47 p.m. By morning, search parties combed the surrounding woods and fields. They found nothing. No footprints in the snow beyond the normal approach to the aircraft, no signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. Daniel and Catherine Shaw had simply vanished, as completely as if they'd never existed at all. The December wind cut through Sarah Chen's coat as she stood at the edge of the construction site, watching the excavator's claw bite into frozen earth. 35 years of Montana winters had hardened this ground, and the machine groaned with effort as it carved out the foundation for Clearwater Regional's new maintenance hangar. Sarah had been airport manager for 3 years, long enough to know the stories, short enough that they still felt like local legend rather than lived history. The Shaw disappearance lived in whispers among the older staff, in the way Frank Garrison, now 78 and long retired, still visited the airport every Christmas Eve to stand at the window where he'd last seen them. The excavator operator, a man named Tommy Vickers, suddenly stopped. Sarah noticed him lean forward in his cab, squinting at something in the dirt. He shut off the engine and climbed down, his movements careful as he approached the partially excavated trench. "Miss Chen," he called out, his voice tight. "You need to see this." Sarah crossed the frozen ground, her breath forming white clouds in the morning air. Tommy stood at the edge of the excavator's last scoop, pointing down into the dark earth. At first, Sarah saw only dirt and rocks, the expected detritus of construction. Then her eyes adjusted, and she understood why Tommy's face had gone pale. Fabric, blue fabric, partially preserved by the frozen ground, emerging from the dirt like something surfacing from deep water. And beneath it, the unmistakable curve of what could only be human. Remains. "Stop everything," Sarah said, pulling her phone from her pocket with trembling fingers. "Nobody touches anything else." She dialed 911, her eyes never leaving the excavation site. As she waited for the dispatcher to answer, her mind raced through the possibilities. This was airport property, land that had been undeveloped for decades. Land that had been empty fields when Daniel and Catherine Shaw had disappeared on Christmas Eve, 1989. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone, professional and calm, asking Sarah to state her emergency. Sarah took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "This is Sarah Chen at Clearwater Regional Airport. We've found human remains on the construction site. I think—" She paused, looking at the blue fabric, the color of a pilot's uniform shirt. "I think you need to contact Sheriff Morrison, and you need to find Frank Garrison." Within an hour, the construction site had transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and investigators in protective gear carefully excavated around the initial discovery. Sarah watched from a distance, standing beside Sheriff Dale Morrison, a stocky man in his 50s who'd been a deputy when the Shaws disappeared. "Frank's on his way," Morrison said, his voice gravel rough from years of smoking. "He never stopped believing we'd find them eventually." "Is it them?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Morrison nodded slowly. "The excavation team has found 2 sets of remains so far. Both adult. Won't know for certain until we get dental records and DNA analysis, but given the location and the timing—" He trailed off, watching as another investigator carefully brushed dirt away from what appeared to be a second body. A white sedan pulled into the parking lot, and Frank Garrison emerged, moving with the careful deliberation of age. Sarah had seen him around the airport, always quiet, always watching the sky as if expecting someone to return. Morrison walked to meet him, speaking in low tones before guiding him toward the excavation site. Frank stopped at the yellow tape, his weathered face unreadable as he took in the scene. Sarah joined them, unsure what to say. After 35 years of wondering, the not knowing finally had an end. "They were good people," Frank said softly, his eyes on the excavation. "Catherine was pregnant. 3 months along. They were going to tell her parents on Christmas morning." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She hadn't known that detail, hadn't seen it in any of the old reports she'd reviewed. Morrison's expression darkened. "Jesus, Frank, that was never in the official file." "Catherine told me when they arrived that evening," Frank replied. "Mentioned she was nervous about flying, given her condition, but Daniel had done all the pre-flight checks twice. She trusted him completely." He paused, his voice becoming distant. "I never put it in my statement. Seemed like a privacy thing, you know. They'd only just found out themselves." One of the investigators, a woman in her 40s wearing FBI credentials on a lanyard, approached the group. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders. "Sheriff Morrison, we've completed the initial assessment. 2 adult victims, based on skeletal analysis. Both appear to have been here since the time of burial, undisturbed until today." She hesitated, glancing at Frank before continuing. "There's something else you should know. Both victims show evidence of trauma to the skull. Blunt force, pre-mortem." The word hung in the cold air like a physical thing. Murder. Not an accident, not exposure or misadventure. Someone had killed Daniel and Catherine Shaw and buried them less than 200 yards from where their plane had sat with its engine still warm. "That's impossible," Frank said, his voice shaking. "I only looked away for 5 minutes. 5 minutes. There was nobody else at the airport that night. Nobody." Morrison put a hand on Frank's shoulder, steadying him. "We're going to figure this out, Frank. After all this time, we're finally going to get answers." The Clearwater Gazette's archives occupied a basement room in the town library, decades of local history preserved in yellowing newsprint and microfiche. Sarah sat at one of the reading stations, scrolling through the December 1989 editions, her eyes straining in the fluorescent light. The Shaw disappearance had dominated the front page for weeks. Sarah studied the photographs. Daniel Shaw, 32, with an easy smile and pilot's confidence in his stance. Catherine Shaw, 29, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her expression intelligent and warm. Both held commercial pilot licenses. Both had worked for the regional airline that operated out of Clearwater. The articles detailed the search efforts, volunteers combing the woods, helicopters with thermal imaging, search dogs following scent trails that ended abruptly at the tarmac. The FBI had investigated the possibility of voluntary disappearance, but everything pointed against it. The Shaws had no debts, no enemies, No reason to vanish. Their families described them as devoted to each other and excited about the future. One photograph caught Sarah's attention. A group of airport employees standing outside the terminal, dated December 26, 1989, 2 days after the disappearance. Frank Garrison stood in the center, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. To his left was a younger man Sarah didn't recognize, tall and thin with angular features. The caption identified him as Marcus Webb, night maintenance supervisor. Sarah made a note of the name and continued reading. The articles grew shorter as weeks turned to months, the investigation losing momentum as leads dried up. By March 1990, the story had moved to the back pages. By summer, it disappeared entirely. She was about to close the microfiche reader when a small article from August 1990 caught her eye. Local man dies in hunting accident. The victim, Marcus Webb, age 28, killed when his rifle discharged while he was climbing a fence. The article was brief, almost dismissive, the kind of tragic accident that happened in rural Montana with grim regularity. Sarah photographed the screen with her phone, adding it to the growing collection of images she'd compiled. Something about the timing bothered her. 8 months after the Shaws disappeared, the night maintenance supervisor dies in an accident. It could be coincidence. Probably was coincidence. But after 3 decades of mystery, she'd learned that coincidences deserved scrutiny. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sheriff Morrison. "Come to the station. We have preliminary autopsy results." The sheriff's department occupied a low brick building on Main Street, its parking lot half empty in the late afternoon. Morrison met Sarah in the conference room, spreading several files across the table. The FBI investigator from the excavation site, who'd introduced herself as Special Agent Rebecca Knowles, sat at the head of the table. Dental records confirmed the identification. Morrison began without preamble. "The remains are Daniel and Catherine Shaw. Cause of death for both: blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. The pathologist believes they were struck from behind, probably didn't see it coming." Sarah absorbed this, her mind constructing and discarding scenarios. "Were they killed at the excavation site?" "No," Agent Knowles said, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed the burial site from above, the 2 bodies laid side by side with unusual care. "The positioning suggests they were moved after death and buried deliberately. Someone took time with this. The bodies weren't just dumped. They were arranged, almost respectfully." "What does that tell us about the killer?" Sarah asked. "Someone who knew them," Morrison replied. "Someone who felt conflicted about what they'd done. The burial location is interesting too. It's directly in line with the taxiway, about 200 yards from where Frank last saw their plane. The killer would have needed equipment to dig in frozen ground, or they prepared the grave beforehand." Sarah thought of Marcus Webb, the night maintenance supervisor. What kind of equipment did the maintenance staff have access to in 1989? Morrison's eyes sharpened. "Why do you ask?" She showed him the photograph on her phone, the article about Webb's death. He was the night maintenance supervisor. He would have had access to heavy equipment, keys to every building, knowledge of the airport's layout, and he died 8 months after the Shaws disappeared. Agent Knowles leaned forward, studying the phone screen. "Do we have any statements from him in the original investigation?" Morrison flipped through the case file, scanning pages of witness interviews. Frank Garrison, terminal staff, the airline manager, several pilots who knew the Shaws, but no Marcus Webb. No mention of him at all. The 3 of them sat in silence, the implications settling over the room like a weight. After 35 years, the investigation had finally caught a thread. Whether it would unravel the whole mystery or lead to another dead end remained to be seen. "I want everything we can find on Marcus Webb," Agent Knowles said, her voice crisp with authority. "Employment records, financial history, family connections. If he was involved, there'll be traces. People don't commit murder without leaving evidence, even if it takes decades to find it." Sarah stood, gathering her notes. "The library has old city directories and phone books. I can track down anyone who knew him, see if any are still in the area." "Good," Morrison said. "I'll pull the accident report from his death. Might be nothing, but I want to see who investigated it, what they found. As Sarah left the station, snow had begun to fall again, the same silent white curtain that had blanketed Clearwater on Christmas Eve, 1989. She thought of Daniel and Catherine Shaw, young and in love, expecting their first child, excited to spend Christmas with family. Someone had stolen that future from them, had buried them in frozen ground, and let the world believe they'd simply vanished. 35 years was a long time to wait for justice, but as Sarah walked back to her car, she felt the first stirrings of something that might, eventually, become resolution. The dead had finally spoken. Now it was up to the living to hear what they had to say. The Webb family home sat at the end of a gravel road, 15 miles outside Clearwater proper. Sarah pulled up to the weathered farmhouse, noting the sagging porch and peeling paint. A woman in her 70s emerged before Sarah could knock, wiping her hands on a faded apron. "If you're selling something, I'm not interested," the woman said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. Sarah held up her credentials. "I'm Sarah Chen, airport manager at Clearwater Regional. I'm looking into some old records, and I was hoping you might be able to help me. Are you related to Marcus Webb?" The woman's expression shifted, something guarded settling behind her eyes. "I'm his mother, Diane Webb. What's this about? Marcus has been dead for 35 years. "I know, and I'm sorry for your loss. May I come in? I just have a few questions about his work at the airport." Diane hesitated, then stepped aside. The interior of the house was neat but worn, filled with the kind of furniture that had been good quality once but had endured decades of use. Photographs lined the mantel, family portraits, school pictures, a young Marcus in his high school graduation gown. They sat in the living room, and Sarah noticed how Diane's hands twisted together in her lap, a nervous gesture that seemed habitual. "Mrs. Webb, do you remember anything unusual about the weeks before Marcus died? Anything that seemed off to you?" Diane's jaw tightened. "People have been asking me that question for 35 years. The answer hasn't changed. My son died in a hunting accident. It was tragic and senseless, but it was an accident." "I'm not suggesting otherwise," Sarah said gently. "I'm trying to understand what was happening at the airport in late 1989 and early 1990. Marcus worked the night shift, correct?" "Yes. He preferred nights. Said it was quieter, let him think." Diane stood abruptly, walking to the window. "He was a good boy. Troubled, maybe, but good. He didn't deserve what happened to him." Sarah noted the phrasing. "What happened to him? I thought you said it was an accident." Diane turned, her eyes suddenly fierce. "It was an accident, but accidents don't happen in a vacuum, do they? Marcus was upset those last few months, drinking more than usual, talking about guilt and responsibility. I thought it was just the stress of the job, or maybe woman trouble. He never would tell me exactly what was bothering him." "Did he ever mention Daniel or Catherine Shaw?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Diane's face went carefully blank. Everyone at the airport knew about the Shaws. Their disappearance shook the whole community. But did Marcus mention them specifically, before they disappeared, or after? Diane returned to her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "The night before they vanished, Marcus came home early from his shift. I was surprised because he never left work early. He was agitated, pacing the house. I asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't say. Just kept muttering about having to do the right thing, about protecting someone." Sarah leaned forward. "Protecting who?" He wouldn't tell me, but he was afraid. I could see it in his eyes. My son was genuinely terrified of something. Diane's hands had begun to shake. "The next night was Christmas Eve. He went to work as usual. When I heard about the Shaws on the news the next morning, I tried calling him at the airport. He didn't answer, didn't come home until Christmas night, and when he did, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. "Did you tell the police any of this? What was I supposed to tell them?" that my son had been acting strange. Half the county was acting strange after the Shaws disappeared. The police never even interviewed Marcus. As far as they were concerned, he was just the maintenance guy. Nobody important. Sarah felt the pieces shifting in her mind, not quite forming a complete picture, but suggesting a shape. Mrs. Webb, do you know if Marcus kept any records from his work, logs, notes, anything like that? Diane studied her for a long moment. Why are you really here, Miss Chen? After all this time, why are you asking about my son? Sarah made a decision. The news would be public soon enough. We found the Shaws. Their bodies were buried on airport property near the taxiway. They were murdered. The color drained from Diane's face. She stood again, this time walking to a closet in the hallway. When she returned, she carried a cardboard box, its edges worn and corners crushed from years of storage. Marcus's things from the airport. The manager sent them to me after he died. I never looked through them. Couldn't bring myself to. She set the box on the coffee table between them. If there's anything in there that helps you understand what happened, you can have it. I'm too old to carry secrets anymore. Sarah opened the box carefully. Inside were the mundane artifacts of a working life. Work schedules, equipment manuals, a coffee mug with the airport logo. But beneath these, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a spiral notebook with a black cover. She opened it to the first page. Marcus's handwriting was cramped and anxious, the letters pressed hard into the paper. The first entry was dated December 15th, 1989. He told me it was just surveillance, said they needed to know the Shaw's schedule, when they'd be at the airport, when they'd be alone. I thought he was talking about the airline doing some kind of investigation. I should have asked more questions. Sarah's pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. More entries, growing more frantic and disjointed. December 20th, saw the equipment being delivered. He says it's for construction, but there's no construction scheduled. Why is he lying to me? December 23rd, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to tell someone. But who? Frank, the sheriff. What if I'm wrong? What if there's an explanation? The entries stopped on December 24th, Christmas Eve. The final words were barely legible, written with such force that the pen had torn through the paper in places. God forgive me. I knew, and I did nothing. Sarah looked up at Diane, who had buried her face in her hands. Mrs. Webb, who was Marcus working with? Who is he? I don't know, Diane said, her voice muffled. He never told me. After the Shaws disappeared, after Marcus started drinking and falling apart, I begged him to tell me what was wrong. He said if he told me, I'd be in danger too. That the only way to keep me safe was to keep me ignorant. And then he died. Diane raised her head, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The sheriff ruled it an accident, said Marcus was climbing a barbed wire fence with his rifle, and it discharged. But Marcus was an experienced hunter. He'd been handling guns since he was 10 years old. He knew better than to climb a fence with a loaded weapon. The implication hung between them, heavy and dark. Sarah closed the notebook carefully, her mind racing. May I take this? Take all of it. I should have given it to someone years ago, but I was afraid. Afraid of what it might mean, afraid of tarnishing Marcus's memory. Diane wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He was a good boy. Whatever he got mixed up in, I don't think he understood what was really happening until it was too late. Sarah carried the box to her car, Diane watching from the porch. As she drove away, Sarah glanced in the rear-view mirror. The old woman remained there, a solitary figure framed by the doorway of a house full of ghosts. Sheriff Morrison's conference room had taken on the appearance of a war room. Photographs covered one wall, the excavation site, the skeletal remains, the Shaw's abandoned plane. Marcus Webb's notebook lay open on the table, its pages photographed and transcribed, each entry analyzed for meaning. Agent Knowles stood at the whiteboard, mapping connections with colored markers. We have 3 key questions. 1. Who was Marcus working with? 2. Why were the Shaws targeted? 3. Was Marcus's death truly an accident, or something more? Frank Garrison sat in the corner, his presence requested by Morrison despite his retired status. He'd read Marcus's notebook twice, his expression growing more haunted with each entry. "I should have seen it," Frank said quietly. "I was there that night. I should have noticed something wrong." "You can't blame yourself," Morrison replied. "You received a call about your daughter. You were gone 5 minutes. Nobody could have predicted—" "5 minutes," Frank interrupted. "That's all it took. 5 minutes for someone to kill 2 people and vanish without a trace." He looked at the photograph of the burial site. Marcus wrote about equipment being delivered. What kind of equipment? Sarah had been thinking about this since reading the notebook. If the grave was dug beforehand, they'd need something to break through frozen ground, a backhoe maybe, or a small excavator. But airport maintenance wouldn't have had that kind of equipment in 1989, would they? Morrison flipped through old property inventories. No, they had standard maintenance gear, lawn equipment, snow removal, basic tools, nothing heavy enough to dig a grave in December. So whoever Marcus was working with brought in outside equipment, Agent Knowles said, adding this to the timeline on the whiteboard, which means planning, resources, access to heavy machinery. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated. Sarah's phone buzzed with a call from the airport. She stepped into the hallway to answer, returning a moment later with a troubled expression. That was Tommy Vickers, the excavator operator. He was going through his company's old rental records, trying to see if anyone had rented equipment near the airport in late 1989. He found something. She laid a photocopy on the table. A rental agreement dated December 20th, 1989, for a compact excavator. The rental period, 4 days. The signature on the contract made everyone in the room go still. "James Holbrook," Morrison read aloud. "Why do I know that name?" Frank's face had gone ashen. "He was the airport director in 1989, my boss. He retired in 1991, moved to Arizona." Agent Knowles was already on her phone, pulling up records. James Holbrook, age 73, currently residing in Scottsdale. No criminal record. Worked for Clearwater Regional Airport from 1975 to 1991. She paused, reading further. And here's something interesting. He was investigated by the FAA in 1988 for financial irregularities, missing funds from airport accounts. The investigation was dropped due to insufficient evidence. "Missing funds," Sarah repeated. "How much?" $60,000 over a 3-year period. Morrison leaned back in his chair. That's motive territory. If the Shaws discovered the theft, if they were about to report it. Daniel Shaw was meticulous about flight logs and paperwork, Frank interjected. Catherine was the same way. Both of them were sticklers for regulations. If they'd noticed discrepancies in airport finances, they'd have reported it immediately. Agent Knowles added James Holbrook's name to the whiteboard, drawing connections to Marcus Webb, the Shaws, and the equipment rental. "We need to interview Holbrook, but carefully. If he's our suspect, we don't want to spook him before we have enough for an arrest warrant." "I'll make the call," Morrison said. "We'll tell him we're reviewing old cases, routine follow-up. See what he says." They spent the next hour reviewing every detail of the case file, looking for anything they'd missed. Sarah found herself drawn to the photographs of the burial site, the careful positioning of the bodies, the almost ritualistic arrangement. "Agent Knowles," she said slowly, "you mentioned the bodies were laid out respectfully, almost like someone felt guilty. That's our assessment. Could that have been Marcus? The notebook entries show he was consumed with guilt. What if he wasn't involved in the murders themselves, but in the cover-up? What if Holbrook killed the Shaws and forced Marcus to help bury them?" Frank sat up straighter. That would explain why Marcus was so distraught, why he was drinking, why he kept talking about doing the right thing. He knew what happened but was too afraid to come forward. Morrison's expression darkened. And if Holbrook knew Marcus was becoming unstable, knew he might talk, then Marcus's hunting accident starts looking a lot less accidental, Agent Knowles finished. The room fell silent as they contemplated this. 2 murders covered up for 35 years, and possibly a third to ensure the secret stayed buried. Morrison reached for his phone. "I'm calling Scottsdale PD. I want eyes on Holbrook before we make contact. If he gets wind that we're looking at him, he might run." As Morrison made the call, Sarah returned to Marcus's notebook, reading the final entry again. "God forgive me. I knew, and I did nothing." The words carried the weight of unbearable guilt, the kind that might drive a young man to desperate measures, or make him vulnerable to someone who needed to silence him permanently. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it, frowning at the message. "Stop digging. Some graves should stay closed." Sarah showed it to Agent Knowles, who immediately began tracing the number. "Could be a crank," the agent said, though her expression suggested she didn't believe it. "But given the timing, we should take it seriously." "Who even knows we're investigating?" Sarah asked. "The construction crew, hospital staff, anyone who's read the news coverage," Morrison replied, hanging up his phone. "Scottsdale PD is sending a unit to Holbrook's address. They'll maintain surveillance until we're ready to move." But Sarah's mind had caught on something else. "The news coverage has been minimal. We've kept most details confidential. The only thing that's been reported publicly is that remains were found. We haven't released the victims' identities or mentioned that it's a murder investigation." Agent Knowles understood immediately. "So whoever sent this text knows more than what's been reported. They know we're actively investigating." "Which means either they're connected to the case," Morrison said slowly, "or they're watching us very closely." Frank stood, walking to the window. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Clearwater in white. 35 years, he said softly. 35 years, and someone's still trying to keep this buried. Makes you wonder what else they're hiding." The call from Scottsdale PD came at 6:47 a.m. Sarah was already at the airport, unable to sleep, reviewing Marcus Webb's notebook for the 100th time. Sheriff Morrison's voice on the phone was tense. "Holbrook's gone. Scottsdale officers arrived at his residence last night. Place was empty. Neighbors say they saw him loading suitcases into his car yesterday afternoon. No one knows where he went." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "He knew we were coming." "Looks that way. Agent Knowles is working with the FBI's fugitive task force. They've issued a BOLO for his vehicle, flagged his credit cards and bank accounts. But Sarah..." Morrison paused. "Holbrook left something behind. The Scottsdale officers found it taped to his refrigerator, a note that said, 'Tell Frank I'm sorry.'" The words hung in the air, between them. An apology after 35 years, offered in the same breath as flight. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah asked. "Come to the station. We're going through everything again, looking for any indication of where he might go. And Sarah, watch yourself. Someone warned you off this investigation. Until we know who, assume you're being watched." Sarah drove to the sheriff's department through empty morning streets, checking her mirrors more frequently than usual. The text message from the previous night had been traced to a burner phone, purchased with cash at a big box store in Missoula. No surveillance footage, no leads. At the station, Frank Garrison sat in the conference room, staring at a photocopy of Holbrook's note. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. "He was my friend," Frank said as Sarah entered. "We worked together for 16 years. I trusted him, and all that time, he was..." His voice broke. "How could I not have seen it?" Sarah sat beside him. "None of this is your fault. That note," Frank continued, pointing to the words with a shaking finger. "He's sorry. After what he did, after letting me believe for 35 years that I'd somehow failed them, he's sorry." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Agent Knowles entered with a laptop, setting it on the table. "We've been digging into Holbrook's financials from 1989. The $60,000 he allegedly embezzled? That was just the beginning. We found evidence of systematic theft going back to 1982. He was siphoning money from airport accounts, vendor kickbacks, false invoicing. Over 10 years, he stole close to $300,000. Morrison whistled low. Where did it all go? Gambling debts, mostly. Holbrook had a serious problem. Lost money at casinos in Vegas, illegal card games in Billings. By 1989, he was in deep to some very dangerous people. Agent Knowles pulled up a spreadsheet. In December 1989, he made a large payment, $40,000, to a loan shark with connections to organized crime. The payment was made on December 27th. 3 days after the Shaws disappeared, Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. He needed money fast, but why kill the Shaws? Even if they discovered the embezzlement, that's not worth murder. Unless they discovered something else, Frank said quietly. He'd been reading through old airport records that Morrison had pulled from storage. Look at this. Flight manifests from November and December 1989. He spread the documents across the table. Sarah scanned them, not immediately seeing what Frank had noticed. Then he pointed to a series of entries, cargo flights, all departing Clearwater late at night, all listing the same destination, a private airstrip outside Billings. These flights weren't authorized, Frank said. I was the control tower supervisor. I never cleared any late-night cargo operations. But according to these manifests, there were 8 flights in November alone. Well, what was the cargo? Agent Knowles asked, leaning closer. Frank's finger traced across the manifest to the cargo description. Each entry listed the same thing. Agricultural equipment parts. Clearwater Regional is in cattle country, Morrison said. Why would agricultural equipment be flying through here, and at night? Sarah's mind raced. Unless it wasn't agricultural equipment. What if Holbrook was using the airport for smuggling? Agent Knowles was already on her phone, requesting FBI files on trafficking operations in Montana during the late 80s. When she hung up, her expression was grim. There was a major DEA investigation in 1990 looking at drug trafficking routes through rural airports in Montana and Wyoming. The investigation was dropped after a key witness died. Let me guess, Morrison said. The witness died in a hunting accident. No, he died in a car crash. But the timing is interesting. February 1990, just 2 months after the Shaws disappeared. The implications were staggering. Not just embezzlement, but drug trafficking. The Shaws hadn't just discovered missing money. They'd stumbled onto a smuggling operation. Catherine kept meticulous records, Frank said, his voice distant with memory. She was preparing to take on more administrative duties with the airline. Part of her responsibilities would have been reviewing airport operations, including cargo manifests. If she'd noticed discrepancies, she'd have investigated, Sarah finished, and she'd have told Daniel. Agent Knowles added new connections to the whiteboard, the web growing more complex. Holbrook was desperate, deep in debt to dangerous people, running a smuggling operation through the airport. The Shaws discovered it, probably confronted him. He killed them to protect himself. And Marcus Webb? Morrison asked. Marcus worked nights. He'd have seen the cargo flights, might have helped with loading or maintenance. Holbrook used him, probably fed him some story about the flights being legitimate but requiring discretion. When the Shaws died, Marcus realized what he'd been part of. The guilt ate at him. Sarah thought of Diane Webb, the old woman who'd carried her son's secrets for 35 years. Marcus was going to talk. That's what the notebook entries mean. He decided to come forward, to tell someone what he knew. Holbrook couldn't let that happen. So he staged a hunting accident, Frank said, his voice hollow. Made it look like Marcus's own carelessness. Probably got him drunk first, made sure he'd be impaired, made the accident more believable. Morrison's phone rang. He answered, listened, then stood abruptly. They found Holbrook's car, abandoned at a trailhead near Glacier National Park, about 200 miles north of here. Agent Knowles was already gathering her equipment. Search and rescue? Already deployed, but it's rough country and the weather's turning. If Holbrook went into the backcountry, especially at his age, Morrison didn't finish the sentence. They all understood. Glacier in December was unforgiving. As the others prepared to coordinate with the search teams, Sarah remained at the table, studying the web of connections on the whiteboard. 3 people dead, possibly 4 if Holbrook didn't survive the wilderness. all of it stemming from greed and desperation, from a man who'd chosen murder over accountability. Her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. He won't be found, just like the others. Let it go. Sarah's blood ran cold. She showed the message to Agent Knowles, who immediately began coordinating with the FBI's cyber division. But Sarah's mind had caught on something specific. Just like the others, she read aloud. Not the Shaws, not them, the others. Plural. Morrison stopped mid-motion. You think there are more victims? I think, Sarah said slowly, that we've only found the beginning. If Holbrook was running a smuggling operation for years, if people discovered it or threatened to expose it, how many more bodies might be buried on airport property? Frank finished, his face ashen. Agent Knowles made a decision. I'm requesting ground-penetrating radar and a forensic team. We're going to sweep every inch of that airport. She looked at each of them in turn. This investigation just became a lot bigger. The ground-penetrating radar truck arrived on December 22nd, 2 days before Christmas. Sarah watched from the terminal as technicians set up their equipment, preparing to scan 40 acres of airport property. The media had gotten wind of the expanded investigation, and news vans lined the perimeter road. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Frank stood beside her, his reflection ghost-like in the window glass. 35 years ago, almost to the day, he said softly. I watched them prepare for takeoff, excited about Christmas, about the baby, about their future. And now here we are. We're going to find the truth, Sarah said. All of it. The search for James Holbrook had entered its 3rd day. Search and rescue teams had found tracks leading from his abandoned car into dense forest, but a snowstorm had moved in, obliterating the trail. The prevailing theory was that Holbrook had chosen to end his life in the wilderness rather than face justice. Sarah wasn't convinced. Something about the anonymous texts bothered her, their timing, their specificity, the way they suggested knowledge that Holbrook, alone and on the run, wouldn't have had. Agent Knowles approached from the direction of the radar truck. We've completed the initial scan of the construction site area. There are 3 more anomalies that match the signature of the Shaw grave. Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her. 3 more? We're beginning excavation within the hour. I've requested additional forensic teams from the state police. Agent Knowles paused. Sarah, you should prepare yourself. If we're right about this, the body count could be significant. By nightfall, they'd uncovered the first of the new graves. A single victim, adult male, buried in the same careful manner as the Shaws. No identification on the remains, but the forensic team estimated the body had been there for 25 to 30 years. The second grave yielded 2 victims, both female, both young, based on skeletal analysis. The estimated time of death, late 1980s to early 1990s. We're looking at a serial killer, Morrison said, his voice tight as they stood at the edge of the excavation site. Holbrook wasn't just protecting a smuggling operation. He was murdering people for years. But Sarah's instincts pushed back against this conclusion. Serial killers don't stop. They escalate. These bodies are all from a narrow time frame, roughly 1987 to 1990. Then nothing. Why would Holbrook suddenly stop? Maybe he didn't, Agent Knowles suggested. Maybe he just changed his burial grounds after Marcus died. Without Marcus to help him, he'd need different methods, different locations. Frank had been quiet throughout the day's discoveries, processing each new horror with visible effort. Now he spoke, his voice carrying a weight of terrible certainty. Or maybe Marcus wasn't helping Holbrook at all. Maybe Marcus discovered what Holbrook was doing, and that's what the notebook entries meant. I knew. Maybe he knew about other victims, but was too afraid to come forward. Sarah's phone buzzed. Sheriff Morrison's deputy, calling from the station. Ms. Chen, we've had a development. A woman just walked into the station claiming to have information about the Shaw murders. Says her name is Patricia Holbrook. She's James Holbrook's daughter. Within 20 minutes, Sarah, Morrison, and Agent Knowles were in an interview room at the sheriff's department. Patricia Holbrook was in her early 50s, thin and nervous, her hands constantly moving in her lap. Thank you for coming forward, Agent Knowles began. What can you tell us about your father?" Patricia's eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. "I saw the news coverage about the bodies at the airport. I've been carrying this for so long, and I can't anymore. I need to tell someone." "Take your time," Morrison said gently. Patricia drew a shaky breath. "My father was a good man. I need you to understand that. But he got involved with bad people, owed them money. They threatened our family, threatened me and my mother. He was desperate." "We know about the gambling debts," Agent Knowles said. "We know about the smuggling operation." "It was more than smuggling," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people he worked for, they were trafficking drugs. Yes, but also—" She closed her eyes. "They trafficked people. Women, mostly. Young women brought in from Mexico and Central America, moved through rural airports to avoid detection." Sarah felt sick. The two female victims they'd found suddenly took on new, horrifying context. "My father didn't know at first," Patricia continued. "He thought it was just drugs. But in 1987, he found out the truth. He wanted out, but they wouldn't let him leave. Said he knew too much, that he'd go to prison if he talked. So he kept quiet, kept helping them." "And the Shaws?" Morrison asked. Patricia's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Catherine Shaw saw something she shouldn't have. A young woman being moved through the airport late at night, clearly drugged or coerced. Catherine tried to help her. My father panicked. The people he worked for told him to handle it, to make sure Catherine and anyone she told couldn't expose the operation. "Daniel Shaw," Sarah said. Patricia nodded miserably. "My father told me all of this years later, when he was dying. Or so we thought. He had cancer in 2010, was given 6 months to live. He survived, but during those months when he thought he was dying, he confessed everything. Told me about the Shaws, about Marcus Webb, about the others." "Others?" Agent Knowles leaned forward. "How many others, Patricia?" "I don't know exactly. He mentioned a truck driver who asked too many questions, 2 women who tried to escape, a pilot who threatened to report the operation to the FAA. My father didn't kill them himself, he wasn't capable of that. But he helped dispose of the bodies. He buried them on airport property, places where construction wasn't planned, where he thought they'd never be found." The room was silent except for Patricia's quiet crying. "Where is your father now?" Morrison asked. "I don't know. He called me 3 days ago, said the police were asking questions, that it was all going to come out. I begged him to turn himself in, to finally do the right thing. He said it was too late for that." She looked up, her eyes haunted. "But then he said something strange. He said, 'Tell them the truth, Patty. Tell them I was weak, but I'm not the monster they're looking for. Tell them to look at who's still at the airport.'" Sarah exchanged glances with Agent Knowles. "Still at the airport? What does that mean?" "I don't know. I asked him to explain, but he hung up. That was the last time I spoke to him." After Patricia left, giving a formal statement and providing contact information, the 3 investigators remained in the interview room, processing what they'd learned. "Who's still at the airport from that time period?" Morrison asked, pulling up employment records. Sarah's mind raced through everyone she knew on staff. Most of the current employees had been hired within the last 15 years. The only people who'd been there in 1989 were... Her blood turned to ice. Frank Garrison is the only person still connected to the airport who was there in 1989. Frank wasn't a suspect, Agent Knowles said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He's the one who reported the Shaws missing. He's been pushing for answers for 35 years, or appearing to push for answers," Morrison said slowly, "creating the image of a man consumed by guilt and determination, while actually ensuring the investigation never got too close to the truth." Sarah didn't want to believe it. Frank had been kind to her, helpful, seemingly genuine in his grief over the Shaws. But she thought about his immediate presence at every phase of the investigation, his access to all the information they'd uncovered, his knowledge of airport operations that would have made him invaluable to a smuggling ring. "The text messages," she said aloud. warning me to stop investigating. Frank would have known exactly what we were doing when we were getting close. Agent Knowles was already on her phone. "I'm sending units to Frank's address. Sarah, where's he now?" Sarah checked her watch. "He said he was going to the airport. He wanted to be there while they were excavating, said he owed it to the victims to witness the truth coming out. Or he wanted to make sure we didn't find something specific," Morrison said, standing. "Let's go." They raced to the airport through dark streets, emergency lights flashing. Sarah's mind refused to accept what the evidence suggested, yet she couldn't deny the logic. Frank had been there all along, a constant presence, trusted and unquestioned. The airport was dark except for the floodlights illuminating the excavation site. Sarah spotted Frank's car in the parking lot, but the terminal building was locked and empty. They found him standing at the edge of the excavation area, looking down at the newly uncovered graves. "Frank," Agent Knowles called, her hand on her weapon. "We need to talk." He turned slowly, and Sarah saw something in his expression that confirmed her worst fears. Not surprise, not confusion. Resignation. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," Frank said quietly. "James was always the weak link. I told him to run farther, to disappear completely. But he couldn't help himself, could he? Had to leave breadcrumbs, had to confess to his daughter." "You were the one running the operation," Morrison said, moving to flank Frank. "Holbrook was just the face, the one who handled the money, but you had the access, the knowledge, the trust." Frank smiled, a bitter expression. "For 35 years, I played the grieving witness perfectly. The man who looked away for 5 minutes and lost the Shaws. The dedicated public servant who never stopped searching for answers." He looked at Sarah. "You have no idea how exhausting it's been, maintaining that performance." "Why?" Sarah asked, the word breaking on her lips. "Why did you do it?" "Money, at first. Just money. I had medical bills, a daughter who needed surgery. The people I worked for offered me a way out of debt. All I had to do was look the other way, keep certain flights off the official logs." He shook his head. "But then the Shaws. Catherine saw that girl, wanted to help her. I panicked. I couldn't let her expose everything." "So you killed them," Agent Knowles said. "Marcus and I did it together. He thought we were just scaring them, that we'd let them go after making them understand the danger of talking. But I knew the truth. They had to die." Frank's voice was flat, emotionless. "Marcus never forgave me for that. Never forgave himself either. His death wasn't an accident. He put that rifle under his chin and pulled the trigger. I just made it look like he'd been climbing a fence." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. All of it. The decades of lies, the bodies buried and forgotten, the families who'd never known what happened to their loved ones, all orchestrated by a man she'd trusted. "James Holbrook," Morrison said. "Where is he?" "Dead," Frank replied. "Has been since the day he abandoned his car at Glacier. I met him there, told him we'd escape together, that I had a plan. Then I shot him and left his body in a ravine where it'll never be found." He looked at each of them in turn. "You'll find the gun in my car. I was coming here tonight to leave it at the excavation site, make it look like James had been back, like he was still the one you needed to find. But you figured it out too quickly." As Agent Knowles read Frank his rights and Morrison cuffed him, Frank looked one last time at the excavation site where the Shaws lay after 35 years of hidden darkness. "I'm glad they were found," he said softly. "I'm tired of carrying them." The January sun hung low over Clearwater Regional Airport as Sarah stood at the window where Frank Garrison had once kept his vigil. The excavation had concluded 2 weeks ago, revealing a total of 7 victims buried on airport property. All had been identified through dental records and DNA. All had families who finally, after years of unknowing, had answers. Daniel and Catherine Shaw were laid to rest in a ceremony attended by their families and the entire community. Catherine's parents, both in their 80s now, had wept as they finally said goodbye to their daughter and the grandchild they'd never met. Marcus Webb's body was exhumed and reburied with military honors, his death certificate amended to reflect the truth. His mother, Diane, attended the service and afterward told Sarah that she finally felt her son could rest in peace, no longer bearing the weight of forced complicity. Frank Garrison awaited trial on 7 counts of murder, along with charges related to human trafficking and organized crime. Patricia Holbrook had led investigators to her father's true burial site, not at Glacier National Park, but in a shallow grave in Frank's own backyard, where he'd been since the night he called his daughter for the last time. The trafficking ring had been extensive, reaching across 4 states. Federal prosecutors were building cases against 12 additional suspects, including the loan sharks who'd first ensnared James Holbrook and the organized crime figures who'd run the operation. The investigation would continue for years. Sarah had been offered a commendation by the FAA for her role in uncovering the crimes, but she'd declined. She hadn't been looking for recognition, just answers, justice, truth. The kind of truth that allowed Catherine's parents to finally visit their daughter's grave, that let Diane Webb sleep without nightmares for the first time in 3 decades. Agent Knowles stopped by the airport one last time before returning to her FBI field office. She found Sarah in the administrative office, reviewing safety protocols and updated security measures. "You did good work here," Knowles said. "You sure you don't want to consider a career change? The Bureau could use someone with your instincts." Sarah smiled. "I'm happy where I am. Besides, someone needs to make sure this place stays clean. Too many ghosts here already." They walked together to the window overlooking the runway. Construction on the new maintenance hangar had resumed, but the area where the bodies had been found would remain undeveloped, converted instead into a memorial garden. 7 trees would be planted there, 1 for each victim, with plaques bearing their names and the dates they'd been stolen from the world. "Do you think Frank was telling the truth?" Sarah asked. "When he said he was glad they were found, that he was tired of carrying them?" Knowles considered this. "I think guilt is a heavy burden, even for someone like Frank. Maybe especially for someone like Frank. He spent 35 years playing a role, performing grief while actually experiencing it. That kind of cognitive dissonance destroys a person from the inside. He could have stopped at any time, could have confessed, done the right thing. But then he'd have had to face what he'd become. Sometimes people would rather carry the weight forever than admit they can't bear it." Knowles turned from the window. "The important thing is that it's over now. The victims have justice. Their families have closure. That's what matters." After Knowles left, Sarah remained at the window as evening approached. She thought of Catherine Shaw, 8 months pregnant, excited about Christmas and telling her parents about the baby. She thought of the young women trafficked through this airport, some freed by the investigation's aftermath, some never identified, their families still wondering. She thought of Marcus Webb, consumed by guilt until it killed him. And she thought of Frank Garrison, who'd spent 35 Christmases standing at this very window, maintaining his vigil, his performance, his lie. The snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the ground in white. Sarah watched it accumulate on the memorial garden site, nature's own shroud for the dead. In a few months, when the ground thawed, they'd plant the trees. 7 lives remembered, 7 truths finally told. She locked the office and walked to her car, passing the spot where Daniel and Catherine Shaw's Cessna had sat with its engine cooling, its cabin door open, its passengers vanished into the December night. The plane was long gone, sold for parts decades ago, but the space remained, a negative imprint of what had been lost. As Sarah drove home through the falling snow, she thought about the nature of secrets, how they grew heavier with time, how they infected everything they touched, how their revelation could destroy or redeem. The Shaw case had done both. Destroyed Frank Garrison, redeemed Marcus Webb, given answers to families who'd waited decades, taken away the comfortable lies they'd built to survive the waiting. Truth, Sarah reflected, was neither kind nor cruel. It simply was, and sometimes that was enough. The airport lights faded in her rearview mirror, and Sarah didn't look back.